Nissan's presence in Africa dates back more than 60 years, characterized by a mix of imported units and locally built models that have broken records in various segments. The new Nissan Navara, which is manufactured in South Africa, builds on Nissan's 4-decade Bakkie heritage. Nissan has invested over 3 billion rand preparing to build this iconic model over the last 6 years. From modifying our facilities to accommodate this model, which included a new press machine for our stamping plant, this new automated press line will enable us to deliver high-quality vehicles in accordance with Nissan's global quality standards. To insourcing our own electro-deposition facility for our in-house assembled chassis frames, we improve not only our quality, but also our synchronization with the customers by reducing lead times. All of this would not have been possible without investing in the skills and capabilities of our employees across all levels of the organization. This training included extensive time in Japan and other global plants, as well as with the support of Nissan's global experts who were physically in South Africa during the different project phases to train and mentor our young engineers. These developed skills meant that when the COVID-19 pandemic hit and the world paused, we were able to continue our launch activities to meet important project milestones with little help from our global counterparts. Partnerships with government, the AIDC, and our local and international suppliers aided the project's success. We are operating an incubation program in collaboration with the AIDC to give small and medium businesses the opportunity to enter the automotive industry and become automotive industry participants over a 5-year period. Today, Nissan South Africa offers the entire range of the new Nissan Navara, including the single cab and double cab versions, to the South African market, as well as the rest of the African continent. To further expand our manufacturing presence on the African continent, we engaged with governments in Africa's key markets, including Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya, to shape viable automotive manufacturing industries in these countries. In 2014, we made history by becoming the first automotive manufacturer in recent times to produce vehicles in Nigeria through a DKD assembly plant with our local partner. In 2018, we signed an MOU with the government of Ghana for the establishment of a viable automotive manufacturing industry in the country. By 2020, we began a skills transfer and upskilling program with our partner in Ghana in preparation for a Nissan Ghana DKD operation, which was announced in the same year. Today, Nissan established assembly facilities in Ghana and Nigeria, in addition to the manufacturing plants in South Africa and Egypt. The new Nissan Navara, made in Africa for Africa.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to plenary panel 4 of the Manufacturing Indaba 2021. This session entitled Made in Africa, African Manufacturing Success Stories and How They Achieved It. The issue is we talk a lot about industrialization in Africa, but we're not really there. The people seem to feel, or the experts and the analysts, that this is potentially a silver bullet for Africa. And that Africa has the capacity to become the globe's low-cost manufacturing hub. We have many things that should contribute to this: cheap workforce, plentiful raw materials, low-cost agricultural products, etc. So that makes us well positioned, but we are not there. And the question is, why? What are the issues that we have here? So I think we need to look at the issues, or our panel will look at the issues of what is our competitive advantage, what drives success. Is industrialization the model for Africa actually? How do the new trends, fourth industrial revolution, African free trade area, etc., plug into this, and can we go beyond what we have now, which is pockets of success in industrialization, to widespread industrial capacity and production? Or are we on another pathway? And basically that is one towards services, which is where we currently seem to be. So here to discuss some of these complex issues with us today, you do have their full bios in your course, in your pack, but I'm just going to briefly introduce the 4 speakers with us today. Professor Christopher Kramer is Professor of the Political Economy of Development at SOAS, which is part of the University of London. He chairs the Scientific Committee of the African Program on Rethinking Development Economics, and he has lived, taught, and carried out research in Ethiopia, Mozambique, and South Africa, among other places. We also have Dr. Eki Ayita Okon, who's a political economy scholar and a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Johannesburg's Center for Africa-China Studies. Her interest lies broadly in international and Africa's political economy and development, with a focus on the food, water, energy, environment nexus. Stavros Nicolaou, who doesn't need too much introduction in this particular industrial space. He is the Aspen Pharmacare Group Senior Executive responsible for strategic trade development based in South Africa. Aspen is Africa's largest pharmaceutical manufacturer, and now a world leader in anesthetics and injectable anticoagulants. The company has a presence in over 50 geographies with 26 manufacturing facilities across 6 continents. So extremely well placed to discuss this topic. And last but not least, Johnny Smith, who's the CEO of TransNamib, and he was previously the railway network in Namibia. He's previously served as the CEO of the Walvis Bay Corridor Group, which is a private public partnership in logistics, transports, etc., and has had various roles within Namport and Telecom Namibia. So with that done, I'm just going to move on to our first round of questions. So Christopher, I'd actually like to start with you to set the scene for the discussion. Maybe you can just talk us through where we are or where we have come from in terms of industrial policy in Africa. Have governments, who's leading? Is it government? Is it the private sector? Is it policy that's driving this, or is it the private sector seeing the gaps and leading the process in the absence of policy initiatives? I think we could look at, for example, the Dangote Group as an example of private sector-led policy in Nigeria, and perhaps the government in South Africa's auto policy, the government-led interventions in the auto sector in South Africa as kind of examples on either end of the spectrum. Can you just share some of your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Diana. I mean, I think sort of more broadly, picking up your beginning of your question, the key thing is it's hugely varied. So there's an enormous amount of enthusiasm for industrial policy across the continent, much more than there was a few years ago in a way. But what that really means varies greatly, both between countries and I would say very much within countries too. And you gave 2 quite good examples. So, in Nigeria, there's been for years an NIRP, a Nigerian National Industrial Revolution plan, but it's not wholly coherent and not always implemented in a hugely effective way. But there's a backward integration program which has been very, very important for exactly what you mentioned for the Dangote Group. So both in cement, but also in food processing groups and stuff. Extraordinary manufacturing success in Africa. And I think one would have to say that really Dangote sort of drove that and has forged very, very good links with people across the political spectrum that brings forward a certain sort of consistency in their ability to benefit from the incentive systems and so on. But it hasn't really broadened out very dramatically from and around Dangote. And that, again, I think is because effectively it's been more private sector in the form of Dangote Group leading it rather than a coherent, consistent government approach. If you look at somewhere like Ethiopia, there has been, or at least was, a really, really coherent central state-led industrialization strategy. And it took off from a very, very low base, but it was achieving fairly remarkable successes from that very low base. But sadly, it's been, I suppose, for now, threatened by political upheavals, also running into a balance of payments constraints, and it's a little unclear where that will go next. You have places like Morocco, where I think, again, there is a balance, but quite a clear strategy, and it's been there for quite a long time. And then you have somewhere like South Africa, as you mentioned. The auto industry is an interesting one. I think in South Africa, we could talk about this more, but there's a mixture, isn't there? You know, there have been fairly clear policies and programs as attempts to support manufacturing change in certain sectors, and above all, perhaps in the auto industry, but not across the board. And I would say even on the auto sector, Diana, you characterized it slightly as government policy leading. I'm not sure I would wholly look at it like that. I think if you look at the auto sector, and maybe others would disagree, but what you see over the years in South Africa is a very, very powerful lobby group led by the foreign companies, by the multinational companies. So it's a mixture of that and what we might pick up on later by way of slight inconsistencies in government policies that have made it quite successful within South Africa. But when you compare it with other countries, auto industries, Thailand, Brazil, Mexico, it leaves a lot to be.
And in fact, a lot of African countries are looking at the auto industry at the moment for their industrialization, interestingly. All right, Eki, I'm going to move on to you. I know I've defaulted into your shortened version of your name. I hope that's okay. So I just wanted to look at a lot is premised on how we compete with Asia in terms of looking at industrialization. And one of those, and in fact key among them, is low wages. You know, the expectation that we'd get a lot of the jobs coming to Africa as wages went up in Asia. And how does this square with the drive for greater empowerment in Africa? Can we start with a very low base with wages to provide an opportunity to move up the value chain, which is something that Ethiopia has done, particularly with its textile industry? Or should we not compromise on this issue? And if so, how do we then compete? Is it on productivity? Is it on other areas? What do you think?
Thank you very much for that question, and good day to all the panelists. While I agree that low wage is an important indicator or important economic indicator, I think that it is indeed a consequence of other issues that we perhaps need to address as well. And referring to the Ethiopian example, I think that when you look at the successes of the textile industry in Ethiopia, it's a combination of a host of things. For instance, it's mostly a developmental stage where you have the government at the helm of planning and shaping and executing industrial policies. You also find that an increase in the exports as a result of these aggressive expansionary monetary and physical policies increased exports, and through that they were also able to better their terms of trade. And as a result of that, you began to see an increase in wages. So when we look at Africa or sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, where the labor is intensively concentrated in the agricultural sector, of course, which with high levels of labor, you have low wages within the agricultural sector, most of which are still largely subsistence farming. So one thing we want to achieve or strive for would be to, build up an agro-industrial base where we start off, as we are currently experiencing, low wages, but as we improve, as we have expansionary monetary policies, expansionary fiscal policies, with the government actively involved in ensuring that there is indeed a spillover effect, or what we call a multiplier or accelerator effect, which spills over into other key sectors, such as infrastructure development, for instance, which would also increase and improve aggregate demand within the domestic economy. That in itself would lead to an increase in wage. It would move from having the low wage syndrome, if I could call it that, to having more of an average, and perhaps with the 4IR on course, having high wages within these different sectors. So it's more about having a developmental state with aggressive monetary, expansionary monetary and physical policies, which would lead to or have a spillover effect into the wages that we earn in these respective sectors.
How do you see trade unions fitting into this picture that you've just outlined?
That's a great question. I think, when I think about sub-Saharan Africa generally, of course, with South Africa included, and I picture, the weaknesses or the agency that trade unions have within these different countries in sub-Saharan Africa, I think there just needs to be an understanding that, considering that, 60% of employment is concentrated in the agricultural sector, there is a need to industrialize the agricultural sector. It's not just about manufacturing, which, as we know, China has taken over globally. So Africa's contribution, through the African Continental Free Trade Area, which agreement, which we'll get to later on, there needs to be an understanding. There needs to be an understanding between the government, within the trade unions, for a long-term, perhaps a short, medium, and long-term implementation plan or industrialization plan. And with the government, if the government fails to achieve the set plans, I think Ethiopia has, a growth and transformation plan, if I'm not mistaken. So a similar plan is necessary within the largely SSA. So an understanding between the trade unions and the government, and holding the government accountable to ensure that these policies are being implemented, is indeed key to achieving an agro-industrial base within Africa, which would therefore improve the wage situation in the region.
Great. Okay, thanks very much for that. So Stavros, I'm going to move on to you. You're in the eye of the storm, if you like, with COVID-driven pressure for vaccine manufacturing in Africa. We are quite far behind as a continent, in fact, very far behind as a continent in this regard. And vaccine development is a long-term game. You may remember that the African Union actually, I think it was 2007 or around there, has a pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa, which I think just got dusted off a little bit ahead of COVID. But I just want to know, what do you see as the secret of your success? You've got huge global reach. And also, can Africa catch up? You represent a big success story. Can we catch up? And if so, what kind of route should we be taking?
Right. Thanks very much, Diana, program moderator and fellow panelists. It's indeed a great pleasure for me to be here today. Diane, let me respond directly to your question with the following statement. I believe that local capacities solve local problems, right? And if ever there was a time to understand that, it was the times that we're living in today. And vaccine nationalism, or the uneven distribution of vaccines, is manifest. It's clear. It's there for all to see. And as much as at the start of the pandemic, with its onset last January, the world came together and said, we'll embrace solidarity and all the principles of solidarity, and we'll help each other out. The truth remains that as we sit here today, there are close on 6.7 billion COVID vaccine doses that have been administered globally, and 2% or less of those have found their way into African arms. So it's quite a tragic, but a very surreal indictment on humanity. So let me pick up from where I started to say local capacities solve local problems. And if you have invested strategically in developing or establishing these capacities, as Aspen has done, and we were fortunate enough to invest over a period of time in sterile capabilities. So those sterile capabilities, incidentally, were going to be for manufacturing general anesthetics. And in fact, we are manufacturing general anesthetics out of Quebec in the Eastern Cape. That facility is, in fact, the largest general anesthetic manufacturer in the world outside of the United States. So we set up that capacity, we invested in steriles, and then when the pandemic came along, we were able to reallocate, not repurpose, reallocate some of those capacities to manufacture COVID vaccines. We partnered with Johnson & Johnson at a contract manufacturing level I think it's public knowledge out there that we are going to expand that cooperation to a licensing arrangement, which means we'll license the intellectual property. But to date, we have produced out of our facility in Quebec, for and on behalf of Johnson & Johnson, close on 120 million doses of vaccines. That's more than the entire continent has administered by way of jabs in arms. And we are on schedule to manufacture in excess of 200 million doses over an annualized period. Now, aspens on the continent are far and few between. So let me, in closing my response to you, let me preface something, and I cannot preface it strongly enough, because you're quite right. Every year we wake up to a new African pharmaceutical manufacturing plan, and every year we put a new plan together, and when that plan doesn't kind of work, we meet again and we plan to put out a new plan, right? So the single biggest failing for me on the continent, and you can amplify the pharmaceutical example to many other sectors on the continent. The two biggest failings are, number one, a failure to implement policy, because the localization policies are there. They exist. I can tell you they exist in South Africa. They exist in many parts of the continent. Aspen has plants in Kenya, Tanzania, Ghana. So we've got a fairly good sense of what's happening. So it's the inability and the lack of implementation of policy. That's number one. And number two, the inability of the continent to aggregate its volume so it can get economies of scale. Manufacturing is really all about economies of scale, largely. You get the scale, you're able to bridge the competitiveness gap. Now, what I have seen by way of encouragement, I've got to give you some good news here, Diana, right? I've only given you bad news so far. The good news is that President Ramaphosa, who's championing COVID on the continent and was recently appointed at the 34th sitting of the African Union. He was appointed as the COVID champion. 34th sitting was earlier this year. And part of what he did is help establish a vaccine acquisition platform on the continent, which is headed up by the tech entrepreneur Strive Masiyiwa. And for the first time, I'm seeing all the countries, all 55 coming together, aggregating their volumes, and then going out to the world and saying, we now want to negotiate with you, but from a vantage point of representing a market of 1.3 billion people, not a market of 8 million, 60 million elsewhere, or if you're in Mauritius, 2 million, Botswana, 1.5 million. So you're starting to see this aggregation, which is going to give Africa scale. But there's another important element. President Ramaphosa and Strive have also said, we want to use that volume to find tech partners. So we establish local capacity on the continent, and we will only procure from local manufacturers on our continent. So for me, that's starting to implement the localization policy for the first time. So it holds out a lot of hope. I'm optimistic. I hope my optimism is not misplaced. I don't think it is. But certainly it's a start. And the other sectors on the continent and other countries on the continent need to learn from this experience and start aggregating other areas where we can be competitive and can produce locally on the continent. Thanks very much, Lana.
I think you've made some excellent points there. I mean, I think the question is also, does crisis drive change? Have we turned a corner in terms of this aggregation and cross-border cooperation that you're talking about? Or is it when the crisis abates that this might just become another sort of a stillborn good idea? I mean, I don't want to take the low road, but I just wonder if you can just quickly comment on that.
Yeah, so look, I mean, there's a very real risk, and we've raised this repetitively, right? Because, this pandemic will come to an end. It will become an endemic eventually and more manageable. So it will be, my prediction, certainly like a seasonal flu that you get, seasonal influenza that you get every year, which means the volumes will drop. So there is a real risk that when you get comfortable, you get complacent again, and you start importing all these products. I mean, Africa is a significant, like really, really significant importer of pharmaceuticals. And we have the most disproportionate disease burden of any continent, yet we import the most medicines of any continent. So there's a real risk, Diana, as you highlight. And I think what's going to, in this instance, what's going to be the proof, sort of the pudding here, is that if the multilateral agencies that procure these medicines continue to procure sustainably, then I think Africa has started to crack it in pharmaceuticals. And that's what we're going to be watching very carefully. But the risk that you highlight here is a very real risk and one that we are watching carefully.
Great. Thanks very much, Stavros. Yeah, it will be interesting to see once we keep making our way out of this. But hopefully the catalyst is strong enough for us to continue for once with this program. Johnny, you've been on both sides of the fence, the government, private sector, or certainly linked to the private sector through your Walvis Bay engagement. What is your view of the best way for Africa to industrialize based on your experience in Namibia? And in particular, you know, you are in the sector. Can you say something about the importance of decent infrastructure and the importance of related connectivity, you know, joining other countries together, road, rail, etc., to this end? Obviously, we need to move goods around if we're going to make them. Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Diane. Yes, I think sometimes when we look at manufacturing, we only think about the people ability and the capital ability. But if one looks at the infrastructure and specifically the sector that I've been involved in for a very long time, transport sector, if you look at the cost in terms of the total cost, especially when you look at exports, in Africa, you'll find like some of the landlocked countries, they have a total transport cost is more than 40%, in some instances 45% of the total cost of exports, meaning that that element is becoming more and more critical if you look at countries that doesn't have access to seaports. So during the last I think 15 to 20 years, there's been much more focus for some of the African countries in terms of developing the infrastructure, providing access to the regional and international markets. If you look at our continent and you look at sub-Saharan Africa, I think East Africa has been very fortunate in terms of the partnerships that they've built to ensure that there is also not just more exports from these countries, but also more trade between each other. Now, by virtue of that, what we need to do in Africa, we need to see how we can have better connectivity. But before you can have better connectivity, you must have good infrastructure or infrastructure at a certain level. Now, if I for instance, and one of the previous speakers have already, or the previous speaker has already made reference to putting the market together. So if you look at the South African market alone, look at the population of about 60 million, it could be more, it could be less, but let's look at 60 million. And you look at the whole Southern Africa, which is supposed to be more than 300 million. So once you have that step up in terms of the 300 million, then you have a better bargaining power in terms of manufacturing. Because if you look at most of the biggest successful or the most successful countries, and especially looking at China and so forth, and the rest of Asia, they've been very successful because they've had a good opportunity in terms of the markets are close to each other, good connectivity, and of course the good element in terms of labor cost. But do we have that synchronization at the continent level? Because whenever we speak about Africa, we always divide Africa in 4 regions. So if you put those 4 regions together, then automatically you have, instead of having 300 million, you have 1 billion. And this allow you first to tap into the local, domestic and regional market, and then of course, going to the international market. Now, if I now look back at the Namibia business case, and specifically what we have tried to do at manufacturing, and I like to use examples. We have put an incentive in place, or incentives in place, to lure the international investors to invest in manufacturing, but we haven't been very successful. Now, one of those reasons is because we specifically don't have a big domestic market. Our population is only about 2.6 million at this stage. So you first have to satisfy to some extent your local market in terms of having a successful manufacturing industry, and also because our country has been, and is a young country, only being 30 years independent, we also had to prove a lot to international investors. We have put a lot of investment into infrastructure, especially into transport infrastructure, to the extent that our road infrastructure is actually rated #1 in Africa. And this has helped us to develop our concept of making Namibia a logistics hub. So our process flow is in terms of phases or stages has been different, because now we first had to prove that you can actually manufacture and import as well as export through Namibia or into Namibia. So that's the first step of confidence, is actually the logistics. Does the logistics work? And then we have to now go to the next step and see where are the manufacturing possibilities. So that's really where we are as a country. We've managed to do it very successful in terms of moving freight for the neighboring countries through Namibia. And by virtue of that, what has happened is that other opportunities has been created, is that at the time of independence, that's now about 30 years ago, about 90% of our goods was imported from SA. Whether it was originating in SA or South Africa or coming from somewhere else, it was coming from South Africa. To the extent now that less than 60% of our goods are imported from South Africa. So with that other 30% plus, while we were developing goods, or to import goods through Namibia for neighboring countries, some of our importers, exporters realized, no, we can also now cut off this other link, and now together with importing for the neighboring countries, we then also import for Namibia. So then you have better unit cost. So this is the sort of approach that we have followed. So our first phase or idea did not work so successfully because we first had to put our infrastructure in place. And now we can move to a level where we say, okay, when we start with manufacturing, we have that access to this 300 million consumers within Southern Africa. And by virtue of that, you will also then be able to reduce the unit cost. So let me leave it there for now, Diana.
Thanks, Johnny. I mean, you've raised a critical issue, and that is obviously the connectedness of the countries. You talk about East Africa, of course, that is a much smaller region than most, and it is its infrastructure is connected and improving all the time. So I'm going to move on to the next round of questions, sort of with that in mind. Really looking at what are the main challenges. I think the opportunity is very clear, but what are the main challenges we have in realizing this? And Johnny has talked about the logistics and infrastructure. Stavros has been talking a little bit about political will, implementation, and issues like that. Christopher, I'm going to start this round with you, and let's just maybe stick on this trade facilitation issue. You know, what are we, the African Free Trade Area, many would argue, is coming off quite a low base. Do we have enough things to move around? Obviously, the idea is to increase that. And what are the issues there? Is it a political will? Has it been a political will issue? We've just had big crisis at Bight Bridge, which is South Africa's gateway to the rest of Africa, trucks sitting there for 10 days, all sorts of dramas, and that's a regular thing. And, you know, so where are we with this? I mean, do you see that the African Free Trade Area is going to resolve? Is the political will behind that sufficient to resolve a lot of the problems that we see in moving goods around the continent?
Yeah, the irony is you're talking to somebody who lives in the UK, where we have rather similar problems, and we're trying to kind of leave a huge trading bloc and have our own truck driver shortages and so on. But yeah, it's a very interesting, this one. I think it's important to say that the African continental free trade area is not a panacea. I think there are people who treat it as though this will be the solution to everything. And I think that's sort of quite dangerous in a number of ways. I do think it has certainly potential for some countries. Its potential is weakened, exactly as Johnny was saying, by problems of infrastructure. And exactly, it's not just how many roads and railways and ports you have, it's where they are and how they're connected very often. So I think there's to make the most of the AfCFTA, I think there will need to be a kind of much greater investment in certain kinds of infrastructure. So I think that's one thing. I think there is a political issue. There has been for decades within the four main areas of the continent, I guess. And there's certainly anxiety already that what will happen is that there will be some parts of Africa that will get a lot of gains out of this, but some won't. And it'll be the big ones that win. So it'll be the Cote d'Ivoires, Nigerias that do well, it'll be the Kenyas that do well, and it'll be the South Africas that do well out of this. So there is some anxiety amongst other countries that it won't be all it's made out to be. And I think it also cannot by itself overcome a lot of other constraints. Stavros was talking about having already in the past built up through investment a number of capabilities that allowed Aspen to take advantage of an opportunity and crisis, I guess. And the problem is across the board, there's just a massive need to build capabilities in African countries. And what do we mean by capabilities, productive capabilities? I think it's important to disaggregate. You know, there's knowledge that's textbook knowledge we can get by going to school and university. It's codified stuff. There's a problem at that level. But there's also skills, and very often the kind of skills development programs aren't really fit for purpose. And you find that manufacturing firms, you know, they're not receiving employees who've got the skills they really need. So a lot of those need to be redesigned. And then the third kind of capability, which clearly Aspen has, and a number of other firms do, but it's lacking across the board in many countries, is organizational capabilities. It's how you really do shift when you can, you know, repurpose from this to that, and how you manage firms in very, very dynamic ways. It's not an easy thing to do because it's not in the textbook. It comes from experience and tacit knowledge, and all of that has to happen within a policy framework. I think the other side of the free trade agreement, the free trade area story, is that even if it is worth, which it is, pursuing the best that can be, the reason it's dangerous to see it as a panacea is because it can sometimes be almost an excuse for the failure in other markets. And there are massive gains, despite those infrastructural constraints that Johnny mentioned. There are huge gains still that can be captured from exporting to very large and high value markets globally, and from integrating into global value chains if you do it in the right way, which isn't easy. I mean, I want to come back maybe later to something Eki was talking about, which is agriculture and the missing or the unexploited potential there. But I'll leave that for later. I want to just sort of highlight one more thing in your big question about challenges, if that's all right, Diana, and that's more at the macro and the policy making level. And again, Stavros mentioned policy implementation. What you will find across the board is people worry, or people are very, very attracted, investors are attracted, when policy is predictable, when it's consistent and it is implemented. So it's not always necessarily the most attractive incentives or whatever. It's knowing that when governments tell you that they want to do something, they will do it. And for a while, that was the case in Ethiopia, maybe become less so. In Morocco, you'll find in the auto sector, a lot of investors say, look, the government is really, really demanding about localization, local content, supplying, and so on. But at the same time, it's really, really supportive. And they know that there is a sort of consistent program on both sides there. And I think that makes a huge difference. If you combine that with, and I think that's lacking, it's been lacking in South Africa, for example, over the years, definitely. And the other issue, the missing issue, in a way, Eki was talking about this too, is the macro side. You can't have a sustained industrialization without managing incredibly difficult things at the macro level, the most obvious of which is foreign exchange availability, the balance of payments. And that's proven very hard for many countries to crack.
Great. Okay, that was quite comprehensive. Thanks very much. Eki, we've been talking a lot about you in your sort of absence, as it were. What is your view? What are the main challenges? Do we have too much government? Is government a private sector disconnect ongoing? It seems to be existing in many countries. Should they be working together more closely? We have a lot of intractable problems to resolve. Where do you think this public-private partnership thing plays out in terms of how we can resolve this problem of industrialization?
Thank you very much, Diane. I do agree that, to a certain extent, I don't know about having too much government, because when I think about industrialization and I think about sub-Saharan Africa, and I tend to try to exclude South Africa to a certain extent and just look at your Nigerias, your landlocked countries, your Chad, your Guinea, Equatorial Guinea. So those are countries I have in mind when I think about the feasibility of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and the feasibility of 4IR playing out in the African continent. I think that in these cases, yes, we have governments, there are governments in place. And I think, as Prof. Kramer has mentioned, there tends to be a lacking of political will and commitment. There tends to be discontinuity between different governments. I mean, if you have elections, which I call them, you have elections and one government is ousted and another comes into power, maybe from a different political party, and decides not to continue with the long-term or national development agenda because it wasn't developed or brought about by its own political party. So that has been one of the major problems. In addition to that, so he mentioned lack of political will. He mentioned capital flight, basically, by foreign investors and multinationals within these countries. But also, I think in order for us to have systems that thrive, systems that would create a conducive playground for the African Continental Free Trade Area to become successful, for 4IR itself to actually play out, is that we need to have systems in place. I think one of the crucial elements to having this being successful are the banking systems. I think we tend to forget about them, yet they play a very crucial role. There are quite a number, I mean, as we know, the informal sector in most of these countries are pretty much huge. I mean, 70%, 80%. So they do form one of the backbones of these economies. And if we're trying to catapult them into a free trade areas or a free trade zone with different African countries, different informal economies within sub-Saharan Africa, then there is a need for systems. There is a need for the banking sector to have, for instance, credit systems that these different sectors can tap into. Also, I think one example that comes to mind is Innocent Motors in Nigeria. I mean, with a company like that, trying to build a brand in Nigeria, manufacturing cars, that's something that Nigeria should be applauding. So for such a brand to thrive within Africa, within Nigeria, it needs to have access to credit systems. But for it to do that, it needs to have banks that have these systems in place that it can tap into. Also, when we look at the fourth industrial revolution, I think it's an opportunity, but it also presents a challenge. For instance, when we look at the informal sector making up 70%, 80% of most of sub-Saharan African economies, the 4IR, especially the Internet of Things, allows an opportunity for these sectors or individuals within the sectors, whether you want to look at them as startups or, just a market woman trying to sell, a bag of potatoes or a bag of some agricultural produce online, it allows her to be able to reach out to consumers or customers that are outside her respective immediate jurisdiction. So that's one of the benefits of fourth industrial revolution. However, the state also could be a facilitator or a stifler of such initiatives. So if you have a state who is precarious in a sense, who wants to shut down the internet because it fears being boycotted, or it fears a protest, or it fears whatever domestic issues being aired on the internet, reaching far and wide, maybe key institutions like the UN, for instance, that undermines the ability of these sectors to thrive within the confines of fourth industrial revolution and 4IR, and therefore the 4IR and African Continental Free Trade offers an opportunity for Africa to expand, to move beyond, the limitations that we're currently experiencing. I think it will be a great facilitator, or perhaps that great push that most African governments need to ensure that infrastructures are up to par. You cannot have, or you cannot benefit or gain from the 4IR, you cannot benefit or gain from the Continental Free Trade Agreement if your infrastructure is not up to par. So perhaps this would be the final push, the little nudge that these African governments would need or would use perhaps in ensuring that our infrastructure becomes up to par, that individuals or within the informal sector also get access to markets both within Nigeria, within Kenya, within Chad, within Niger, and also be able to reach South Africa, reach Cape Verde, reach Ghana, reach Senegal. And these are crucial nitty-gritties that perhaps these governments don't think about, but once it's at play, as Professor Kramer mentioned, once the whole process has been implemented, perhaps we get to see these cracks, but also do something about this cracks. It's not sufficient enough to have a policy, talk about it. When it comes to implementation, it falls through the cracks, and then you have a plan to have another plan that would be implemented. So that has been the challenge in the African continent. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Of course, we're at the beginning phases, but it'll be interesting to watch how things play out in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years. And then hopefully we can have a session like this again to debate on the progress that we've made so far.
Let's hope so, that we are talking about the progress and not still the same issues. But we're talking about a capable state and and a confident state. I mean, those are the kind of things I think it's going to take more than a nudge, as you put it, to get there. But just in terms of Stavros, just to get to you in terms of the challenges, we're talking quite a lot about infrastructure here. Regulation is a huge issue in Africa. Most countries are over-regulated, or they're regulated for maybe local protection and other areas like that. I mean, where do you place regulation in the hierarchy of challenges? And the second sort of corollary to that, you have operations in many parts of the world. I mean, what can we borrow? Where are the lessons for Africa from other regions? What is the best practice that we could adapt here in order to give this thing the push it needs?
Diane, firstly, red tape, administrative burden, bureaucracy, those are one of the biggest reasons for investors not looking at a particular market, right? So the minute there is even a slightest sense of a lack of ease of doing business, investors are agnostic. They've got a multitude and a suite of investment destinations they could look at in emerging markets. So what I find is a lot of the regulatory burden on the continent is partly attributable and ascribed to a lack of capacity a lack of skills very often. So you have that on the one side, you have a capacity deficit on the one side. And on the other hand, you have what you've alluded to earlier, you also have regulators and or public servants on the continent that feel that they are only doing their job if they're putting up obstacles, because then it means they're kind of regulating properly, right? So what am I alluding to? I'm alluding to a mindset issue. There's a mind shift that needs to take place in certain parts of the continent. I must say other parts have actually got it right or are getting it right. So in our own country here in South Africa, it's well recorded and well rehearsed that it would take you in excess of 60 days to set up a business in South Africa, right? Whereas in Rwanda, it was taking a few hours. Okay, so there's a mindset shift that's got to take place on the continent to say, for me to be a good and effective and efficient regulator, I've also got to contribute to the economy of the continent, because in no economy, there's no tax base, there's no employment, and the rest of the social challenges that you're intending to confront will never be confronted. So I find that a lot of the regulators, a lot of the public servants on the continent are not necessarily in line ministries outside of the economic clusters, are not necessarily inclined to say, well, growth of the economy or employment on the continent are not my issue. They're an issue for the economic and trade minister. Now, we need to break that mindset, because every single government official, every single regulator on the continent should be, amongst the mandate that they carry out, should also be an enabler and a facilitator of economic growth. And I can tell you, Diane, I often despair with the health department in South Africa, right? Because the officials, and I happen to be a pharmacist, so I can talk quite bluntly, these are people that are pharmacists. They're interested in getting the drugs to the people, okay? But they're forgetting all of this, that if you don't also grow the economy and you don't have a tax base, you're not going to be able to meet the ambitious targets of administering antiretrovirals to everyone, or administering insulin to everyone that's a type 1, maybe even type 2 diabetic. So these are the things that are counterintuitive. So what am I saying, Diana, so they're counterintuitive to economic growth and localization? What I'm saying is there are two areas that manifestly need to be addressed on the continent. Number one is a mindset shift away from, I'm a good regulator if I'm putting up administrative burden. It should be, I'm a good regulator if I'm executing on my mandate, which might be quality, safety, and efficacy of medicine. But at the same time, I'm an enabler and a facilitator to economic growth and job creation on the continent or in the country. So that's number one. And number two, we need to, with urgency, address the capacity deficits on the continent. And the best way to do that is to build local capacity again. And that means if you need to get, so many of these multilateral agencies that throw millions of dollars into Africa, much of this should be spent on upskilling people, on sharing best practices, international best practices. And part of it should be, how do we retain the best skills in the government sector? Now, Africa traditionally loses its best skills to the private sector. So there's an element of job upskilling, but also of retention that needs to take place. So I think those are the two things I would focus on to address the administrative burden, the regulatory, we call it overreach very often, and also speeding up or increase the ease of doing business on the continent.
Thanks very much, Stavros. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, just in terms of governments operating in silos, if you look at ICT, that should be ultimately the cross-cutting sector that goes across all ministries. But because there's a ministry of ICT in many countries, it tends to get stuck a little bit sometimes. Johnny, we've been talking a lot about things from the government point of view. I mean, you have a much more sort of a bird's eye view of what happens in terms of government policy, setting policy and direction and regulation, etc. Can you just give us some your words of wisdom on the experience from this side of the fence?
Yeah, from my perspective, in terms of PPPs, what's the golden rule is that the government must focus on government matters and the private sector must focus on private sector matters. If that golden rule is adhered to and that respect remain, then it will improve. But I've seen a lot of instances where one goes into the territory of the other, and that's where you start having challenges. So in terms of regulation, I would also agree that to a large extent, sometimes our markets are too over-regulated. And if you look at Southern Africa itself, yeah, I think sometimes we're trying to put certain regulation in place to really sort of create barrier, to eventually create barriers. Sometimes you move 2 steps forward, but then you move 5 steps back. So what is important is that we must have that understanding that, as also one of the previous presenters indicated that what is the main objective here? The main objective here is to grow our markets so that eventually all of us in Africa can have a better life. And if we remain with that, from whichever perspective you look at it, if you in the pharmaceutical industry, if you're in the agricultural sector, if you're in the transport sector, is about how do we improve. And I have seen also that you have people from different sectors just pushing their own initiatives, but sometimes when those initiatives are pushed, it creates a disadvantage for another sector. So that's why it's important that everybody needs to have the same understanding and to have that objective to make sure that we must work towards a better life by grouping together. Thank you, Diana.
Yes, I think that COVID has certainly taught us that working together is much more valuable than not doing so, but whether that holds or not is another story. So I see we're almost out of time. I think what I'm going to do is, there's a lot of trends underway at the moment, and I think there's a lot of issues that we're looking at as the continent rebuilds after COVID. There's a lot of talk about we're turning a corner, things are changing, the crisis has got us to look differently at the continent. So I'm just going to ask each of you, we have sort of 2 minutes left, just sort of one thing that you feel is the thing that's most important. Is it 4IR technology? Is it innovation? Is it free trade? In terms of how do we push this industrialization agenda forward? Is it mindset, import dependence, etc.? So I'm going to ask each of you, starting with Christopher, sorry, I should have warned you I was coming with this one, but I'm sure you have a top of mind, seeing as you're all experts in the field. Christopher, starting with you, just one thing.
Oh no, I've got to do 2. So one of them is, let's pick up on what we were just talking about, ease of doing business. That phrase has a bad name now for very good reasons with this rather scandalous World Bank index. I would prefer us to think of an ease of transforming business index, which focuses more on exactly that. It's not regulation, for getting rid of all regulations for the sake of it in the interest of some staid idea of flexibility. It's about how we get the governance of markets and firms and production to serve those larger interests. And you don't get that without this process being led very clearly from the top. That's one. The second thing one thing I did want to mention, which is when we think about industrialization and manufacturing, we think there are certain gains associated with that to do with productivity, employment gains. The world has changed and how production works has changed. And many of the gains we historically associate with manufacturing, you can also get from some high productivity services and also from very high value, non-processed agriculture. so-called fresh agricultural exports. We need policies that can encourage those just as much as traditional manufacturing.
Great, thank you. And that leads me, Eke, to you. I mean, are we on a services path? Are we pushing industrialization too hard? Just reminding you have one sentence to answer that very big question.
Well, I don't think we're pushing it hard enough, but I would love to see a climate conscious industrialization in Africa.
That's true. Something we haven't talked about is energy and the whole climate issue and how it relates to industrialization. So thanks for bringing that up. Stavros, any your last thought on this matter?
Okay. My only thought is we need to have the courage of our convictions, stay the course. It's easy to default to importing because it looks like an easy solution at the time. Stay the course, long haul, and let's do away with Afro-pessimism. We must believe in our own products that we produce on our own continent. And let's stop exporting jobs. Let's export products. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you. That's a good point. You know, need to buy local, but we also need to make it competitive to buy local. I think that comes in time as well. Johnny, last word to you. Last thought on the industrialization project for Africa.
Yeah, the world is evolving all the time. You have a primary, secondary, and tertiary sector. We should start focusing more on the tertiary sector because that's where the world is now. Why do we still focus on primary and secondary so much? Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, I wanted to say thank you very much to this really interesting panel. It is a pity we only have an hour because there's a lot of information and experience sitting, I would say, in this virtual room with me here. And I also wanted to say thanks very much to Cienza, the organizers of the Manufacturing Indaba. I think it's a great event every year and very topical issues to be discussed. So thanks, everybody. And thanks, Zanelli. I think I'm going to sign off now. Thank you very much.